A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Hey everybody, we're here today with Amanda Cote, Assistant Professor of Media Studies and Game Studies at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. She's also a member of the University of Oregon Esports and Games Research Lab, which sounds really cool. Amanda studies digital and analog games, as well as their culture and industry. Her first book, Gaming Sexism, Gender and Identity in the Era of Casual Video Games, was recently published by NYU Press today, and she's here to talk to us about some themes from that. Right? Amanda Cote, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So, there's so much in your book that we really want to talk about, but we decided we're going to focus on really one aspect because, A, this is our very, very long overdue. And when I say long overdue, I mean, Andy and I wanted to do a show about sexism in video games, like from the very beginning. And it took us a while to find the right guest for it. But, I mean, really, really long overdue. And so we decided to kind of focus on the grounding for the current situation, which in your case really kind of focuses on gamer identity and how all of that creates the current situation. So, okay, so you write in your book that games were both opening up to new audiences in the 2010s to the 20-teens. Right? The teens, right? But also that at the same time that they were opening up to new players, they got this backlash against non-traditional players, including female players. So what do you think led to this backlash?
So first, I'm glad you also have a struggle figuring out how we refer to the early 2000s. I wrote this whole book, still not sure how to do it. But I appreciate this question because it does get at what the motivating force behind the book was. So in the early 2000s, of course, we had things come out like the Nintendo DS. We had things come out like the Nintendo Wii, which deliberately targeted families, moms, older players, people that we don't traditionally think of as gamers. And then at the same time, of course, we had the rise of mobile games and social games. That was the Farmville boom was around that time. And so because of all these games coming out, we got a lot of journalistic stories, we got a lot of narratives that anyone could be a gamer now, that games were opening up, that games were now accessible to different players in new ways. But at the same time, within video game spaces, we saw a lot of evidence that that just wasn't true. We saw, for instance, female cultural critics of games facing a lot of harassment for daring to criticize the representation of female characters. Mm-hmm. We had female professional gamers facing sexual harassment from their coaches and speaking up about it. And so I was trying to wrap my head around these two totally divergent narratives. Games are for everyone. Games are definitely not for everyone. And what I end up arguing at the beginning of the book is that these are actually related. That as games have started to deliberately target newer audiences, people who are used to being prioritized find that somewhat concerning and have been trying to use their slightly more privileged position in gaming to prevent or stop that diversification and protect this hobby that they see as really central to their identity.
And do you think that's actually a conscious choice, or do you think it's just happening subconsciously?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I don't think it's necessarily a conscious choice. And I also don't think it's all gamers trying to guard gaming from change. I and my participants, the women that I spoke with for the book, who are often longstanding female gamers, largely find that most players are great. Most players are supportive. Most players want more people to play games because then they get more games. But a very small number of people are very vocal about not wanting games to change. And those are the people who are kind of at the heart of this backlash against games diversification.
I really want to ask if, the early teens, right, are 10 years ago now, and it seems like a long time, especially in gaming time. And part of me really wonders, I want to ask if things have changed, but I feel like we got to get there first. right? And
All right, so we can put a pin in that for later.
yes, right. Because I mean, I want to ask if things have changed. I want to ask kind of what kind of ethical issues for women kind of came out of this kind of backlash. But let's kind of build up to it. So, how did this idea that games were masculine activities kind of come about in the first place?
Oh, so many
Right.
forces.
Right.
Apologies if this is a really long answer. So games, where video games emerged from were very masculinized spaces. The very earliest video games created came out of military research facilities. So people disagree on what counts as the first video game. But the usual contenders are either Tennis for Two, which was kind of an analog game created at Brookhaven National Laboratories in 1958, just on a whim for Visitors' Day, for something people could have fun with and play while they were visiting the nuclear research lab. The other contender is, of course, Space War, which was created at MIT by students kind of playing with their department's computers in their off hours. But those computers were largely funded by military research funds. And so both of these first contenders for original video game came out of spaces that were more accessible to men and boys at the time than largely to women. And that kind of continued a little bit as games became popular. While we know that men and women both played arcade games, we know that men tended to do so in higher numbers. Arcades were often seen as potentially risky or deviant spaces. There are these dark buildings with these flashing lights. You're not really sure what everybody's doing in there. They have connections to things like pinball and organized crime, which is a whole nother history that I don't know if we have time for. Those spaces were therefore more open to men and boys than women and girls, because we give men and boys kind of more freedom to move in public spaces. And my colleague, Carly Kosurik, her book, Coin-Operated Americans, goes through all of that in depth. Then video games had a crash in the 1980s. The North American video game industry kind of dried up quite quickly due to both economic recession as well as producing a surplus of not very good games. When games decided to recuperate from that and came back, companies were really interested in managing their risk. And so they chose to target audiences that were narrower and audiences that they knew had already existed. Young men, boys, we see that really ramp up through the late 1980s and 1990s. And that's just kind of stayed since then. All of these introductory forces keeping the same kinds of games being produced and keeping them targeting the same kinds of audiences.
So at the same time, you say that in the 90s, there was actually an attempt to diversify games and move somewhat away from that and make it more inclusive for women. At the same time, I know that right in the 90s, I think we hit like peak sexualization of women, of female characters in games. What happened then?
Yeah, so there was a deliberate movement in the 1990s, the girls' games movement, to try and reach new audiences. And this was not trying to revamp the entire video game industry, which, as you point out, was doing some very interesting things in their advertising and character design. This was meant more to be kind of an alternative stream for reaching female players. And designers in the girls' games movement really tried to meet girls where they already were, developing games that focused on social relationships and friendships, for instance, or soccer was very popular for girls in the 1990s. And so these designers said, okay, like traditional games, you can go do your own thing. We're going to focus on this audience and we're going to meet girls where they are. One of the big founders of this movement was Brenda Laurel, who created the game company Purple Moon. So, for instance, one of their popular games was the Rocket series, which was about this girl named Rocket dealing with the trials and tribulations of middle school, making friends, dealing with friends' jealousy, going to school dances. Their last game was a soccer game, so highlighting that 1990s interest in women's soccer. The girls' games movement was for girls a success. Many girls purchased these games, loved them, contributed to online forums about them, but it ended up being, unfortunately, kind of a blip in the history of games. The late 90s decline of the CD-ROM market kind of decimated the production structures of those games. But it also kind of fell prey a little bit to too many cooks in the kitchen kind of problem. Game developers wanted to make games that would be a success, regardless of what that meant. Feminist activists sometimes felt that targeting girls where they were was just reinforcing gender norms and wouldn't actually solve the problem of getting women into tech. So there were a lot of disagreements about what the correct approach to this would be. And so unfortunately, by the late 90s, most of these companies that had formed to make games for girls ended up closing their doors. And I'm going to bring her up again, but my colleague, Carly Kosurik, also has a book on this. In the Influential Video Game Designers series, she wrote a book on Brenda Laurel, the founder of Purple Moon and one of the leaders of the girls' games movement, that gets into this in much more depth.
I sort of feel like that sort of coincided with like the way toys and games were also sort of super differentiated in the way that they were sold. Like when you go into if you'd gone into Toys R Us at the time, it was like the pink aisle and the blue aisle.
Oh, that hasn't really changed, Andy.
It has not.
Well, I mean,
that has not changed. Yes.
Toys R Us, of course, is gone.
Right.
But,
that has changed.
But Target sort of does a little bit more mixing nowadays. It's a little bit less, especially in their games aisle. They don't necessarily do that completely. I mean, there's still a little bit of that, but it seems like it was like super binary.
But it is a really and yeah, it's interesting because maybe it's interesting how the movie towards non-binary gender identity really that puts a lot of this into question. But it is interesting, right? You have these kind of two approaches. One kind of expand the current offering to say it's for women and girls too. The other is construct things especially for women and girls. And if you do that, are you essentially, assuming some sort of either gender essentialism or, something where you're saying games for women and girls are different than right? And so, how does this end up connecting to gamer identity? This idea that games for women and girls are different.
Yeah, so that's actually a problem that still persists. In my book, I interviewed a whole bunch of female gamers, and they played a wide array of games, loved a whole bunch of different varieties of games, from role-playing games to first-person shooters to Candy Crush. But where they felt the industry targeted them and expected them to play was a pretty narrow band. One of my participants had this great line where she said the industry treats women as a genre. And so she used the example of things like Nintendogs, a game where you take care of dogs on a portable system, as an example of the kind of games that women tend to get. She also jokingly summed up the entire industry of women's and girls' games through the fictional title Dora the Explorer Goes on a Princess Adventure, I believe was her made up game title. And so a lot of my participants found that the games that are still marketed and targeted towards women do follow these pretty strict gender binaries. It's games about taking care of animals, riding a horse, cooking, games like Cooking Mama. And they didn't hate these games. They liked them. Several of my participants loved Cooking Mama. They thought it was so fun and so well done. But they somewhat resented that those were the only moments they felt the industry was really speaking to them, because they also liked first-person shooting games, adventure games, role-playing games, and they felt that it was hit or miss whether they were included in those spaces. So they loved games like Mass Effect, where you have the option to play a male character or a female character, because they saw that as, these people want me to play their game. But a lot of other games like that don't offer that option. And so they felt that they were often in afterthought in those sections of the industry rather than being deliberately included. And the section that always deliberately included them tended to be kind of heavily gendered.
Right. I wonder, and it still only just now occurred to me, and I don't know, like the marketing of these games creates the spaces that are ultimately then played, like that where the people actually, like the communities that form out of it is really formed out of that marketing. And sometimes I think that certainly when making a mass market game, we're not necessarily thinking boys only. But if it's marketed that way, then that's sort of the community that's going to form out of it, right?
Yeah, I will say, women always play games that are marketed as for men. My female
Sure.
participants, like if I said, "What games are you playing?" It was a list every
Yeah,
single
of course.
time.
Of course, but I mean, in terms of like feeling accepted in those spaces,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. And that led to a whole nother set of issues around identity, which the original question was about, where female gamers played these games and were good at them, often extremely good, but were often still treated as outsiders or as potentially suspicious or suspect because they weren't part of this kind of ideological or imagined audience for that game. And so they often faced what I refer to in the book as both overt and implicit forms of sexism. So overt sexism would be the kind of in-group, out-group harassment, the go back to the kitchen and make me a sandwich kind of behavior that's directed at people who are seen as not belonging.
Right.
But implicit or inferential sexism is often more insidious because it's things that don't appear to be negative or sexist on the surface, but rest on an assumption that women aren't supposed to be there. So continually being treated with surprise, oh my gosh, a girl who games, I'm so excited to see you here, was just in many ways as off-putting as actually being harassed, but harder to combat because it didn't seem like a bad thing. Several of my participants also found that male players would offer them help, even if they were a higher level than the person offering them help, because of this assumption that they weren't the game's target audience, because of this assumption that obviously they were new and needed help because this game, women didn't play this game. And so they found that incredibly frustrating to be, max level in World of Warcraft with impressive gear arrays and still have people being like, oh, let me help you with this quest. So those kind of more subtle forms of sexism were really frustrating.
Right.
Maybe this is a good point to talk about the idea of the gamer girl. So at one point, we had this Facebook post where I'm not even sure for what, but we used the hashtag gamergirl. But someone, and it was a male, commented that there's no such thing as a gamer girl, right? There's only gamers, and I couldn't tell if he was trolling us, and actually that might have been our first troll, Andy. But I thought it was a very you can take a claim like that in so many ways, right? I mean, you could take it as positive, as negative. What do you think of the game, or what do women think of of this kind of label as an identity?
This comes up so much. And the reason why is because gamer girl or girl gamer often gets used in a pejorative context. It is often leveled against female gamers as one of these forms of sexism. And so in my book, I kind of extensively discuss the girl gamer stereotype, which has kind of two facets. First is the assumption that women are only casual gamers who are only interested in things like Candy Crush and don't like more serious games. The other side of it is the idea that women then, if they play more serious games, are only doing so to get attention from men, which my participants hated because they found that this pressured them either to have to prove their skill, to prove that they belonged and didn't just play casual games, but then even if they succeeded in doing so, people expected them to flirt or pay attention to male players because basically their presence in the space and their ability to participate in it fully was constantly under question.
Right.
So in that circumstance, the gamer girl or girl gamer stereotype is a barrier that female gamers have to overcome, and kind of a stereotype that's used against them in a lot of ways to question their presence in game spaces. On the other hand, because we have such a long-standing understanding of gamer equals male, a lot of my participants also felt it was important to take on an activist role and prove that no, not all gamers are men. Women are here, have long been here, have the same level of skill and commitment as others. And so in that context, sometimes they would forefront both their gaming skill and their female identity as an activist move, a way to prove that they were there and that they belonged. So for instance, one of my participants, Kiana, played a whole bunch of board games, a wide array of board games. I don't think I've ever seen somebody off the top of their head list as many board games as she can. And she often posted them to social media with the girl gamer hashtag, because that was her way of saying, look, I know this sphere. I love it. I'm here. I'm important in this space. And I am also female. And so that's a girl gamer, gamer girl. It really depends on context. It has both a potentially positive side and a potentially negative side.
Right. Is that sort of like a reclamation, reclaiming the word?
Yes, exactly. So, for instance, a really big forum for female gamers is on Reddit, r/girl gamer, and their little blurb about their part of Reddit is we're taking back the term. So it is a very deliberate and thoughtful approach to that when women use that term on their own.
Though it's interesting. I mean, to me, this is identifying yourself as a member of a minority group, or especially a minority group that's been oppressed, right? Is something that's done in a lot of spheres, right? In our society, and it's interesting how it's done how it's done here in gaming, because gaming is one of those situations where, in some ways, it's possible to be anonymous. And yet identity really matters. And yet you also lose something in being anonymous, especially if being anonymous means that everybody assumes that you're different than who you really are, because the standard is that you are a man.
So that was a dilemma that female gamers had to deal with a lot. The question of when and how and to whom they wanted to reveal their identity. So a lot of female gamers played games to relax, to have fun, to detox after a tough day of work. Sometimes having others know that they were female made it difficult to achieve those goals. So they often would not use voice chat, use a gender-neutral username, not let anybody know that they were female. But then they sometimes felt guilty about that, because then they felt that they were allowing the assumption that all gamers are men to continue. And so some of them did things like they had 2 accounts for games, one with a feminized username and one with a gender neutral username. And when they had the energy to take an activist stance, they'd play the feminized one. And when they didn't have that energy and just wanted to relax, they'd play the other account. And so this was kind of a constant negotiation that a lot of my participants were going through. As longstanding skilled gamers, they felt it was kind of important for them to prove that they were there, prove that they belonged, prove that they had skill and experience in gaming, but they also had to balance that with prioritizing their own needs and their own experiences. And so that came up over and over again of when do I use voice chat and how.
Right. And that relates to code switching, how minorities deal with expressing their identities or not expressing their identities, outside of the norm.
Given all this, and I know that, you're talking about your research and all that, what do you have a personal opinion about the usefulness of the term gamer girl at this point in time?
Ooh, that's a good question.
And from everything you said, I mean, you obviously see a lot of complications in it, and that's why I'm curious what you personally think.
Yes, that is a good point. I don't personally use it, but I also don't play online games. So if I am discussing my gaming, people see me, and therefore I guess I don't feel any pressure to add the caveat to that, because discussing my gaming experience in forums like this, or for instance in my game studies class, it's already pretty obvious that I'm bringing my gender identity to the forefront as well. So I generally don't employ it, but I do think that has to do a lot with the circumstances in which I talk about games. I think if people are comfortable using the term and want to try to reclaim it, like, more power to them. And many of my participants have done that because they do find it useful.
Now let's move to the core gamer identity. Okay, so when people talk about gamers, right? What is this idea? And let's connect it back to the kind of original story of how the gamer identity forms, and what is the gamer identity?
Yeah. So, we've talked about how gamer identity is masculinized. Gamer identity tends to be associated with men and boys. But it kind of goes beyond that, right? Like, if we think about gamer identity in its most stereotypical format, we're getting like a young, nerdy, white or Asian young man who, lives in his mom's basement. That's the most extreme form of the stereotype. And that's been reinforced by a lot of factors, both within games and within broader pop culture. We think about the jocks and geeks that are ever present in teen shows and movies. Mm-hmm. And so gamer identity has in many ways been masculinized, which, is in modern society an empowering place to be. But it's also kind of marginalized because these are usually men who are presented as less than in popular culture. And gamers have also had to deal with claims of, Dungeons and Dragons and Satanism, or video game violence and school shootings. And so gamers occupy in many ways a privileged position in how they're stereotypically defined, but don't always necessarily feel like it's a privileged position because they're still marked as potentially deviant or less than, the wholesome all-American athlete. And so the gamer stereotype occupies this really interesting space between privilege and margins. And so that has meant that for many people, gaming becomes core to their identity, almost in kind of like a resistant or hazing way. Like, because I've had to deal with all these negative stereotypes about myself, I'm going to embrace this identity and I'm going to embrace this community, and you can't take that away from me, or you can't tell me otherwise. We're pushing back against how you think about us. So that's an interesting position to be in, and then face the specter of change. Oh, we've had this space that is ours. We've protected it against all of these threats from outside. And now all these people are coming in who don't understand what's going on. What is this going to do for our community and our identity? And so that's kind of the struggle that's going on, often in unconscious ways, around what gaming is right now.
Can I want to go in two simultaneous directions here. Number one, I mean, has the public perception of a gamer changed over time because gaming has just broadened so much? Right? I mean, your high school athlete like plays games all the time these days, right? So has that changed over time? And if that has changed, is it that the more traditional gamer identity has it widened, or does it just feel more it wants to hold more to the geekdom of it, also against this kind of broadening?
I do think that the stereotype has expanded and is expanding. Games are pretty mainstream now,
right.
And especially with the rise of things like esports, with the rise of things like video game live streaming, it's largely impossible to avoid games at this point.
Right.
And so we finally see all the many diverse people who play games and have played games for a long time. There are still some limitations. And I think it'll be time before we see, for instance, change at those highly competitive, highly skilled levels. For instance, if you look at esports, predominantly young men still. And that's for many reasons. Women don't end up competing at those high levels. The idea that gaming is still for men leads more young women to drop out. They often still have to deal with harassment or questions about why they're there. And so few of them make it to those high levels right now. So I think over time, we'll still see change happening. But I think the overall stereotype of a gamer is now more firmly recognized as a stereotype because we see so many others involved.
That makes it even weirder, right? Because yeah, we talk all the time now about the stereotype of the gamer, right? And yet, right, you're saying that we still have all these people who are kind of holding on to this gamer identity that began as a stereotype of a sort. Am I getting that right or not?
And it's because it seems like in some ways it very much mirrors the idea of the gamer girls who really hold on to that and are claiming and staking a claim in that word in that term, right? These guy gamers who are sort of staking a claim and being that nerdy living in the basement. No, this is the way that it's supposed to be.
I sometimes like to think about it as kind of like hipsters, like we were into this before it was cool, as if being the first to a space makes you a more valid occupant of that space.
Right.
And also, you can see where like we were in this before it was cool, so we got shoved in lockers. And you haven't gone through that experience, so you don't truly understand what it's like. You can see why that concern or resentment about the entry of new participants can persist.
Oh, absolutely.
Even though, of course, the stereotype doesn't hold up and never truly reflected everybody who played games.
That's
but
right.
Stereotypes still have power.
Even in the early days of computer games, there were women involved from the ground up. They weren't highly publicized, but they were there.
Yeah, some of the first esports competitions were won by women. Stevie Case is a great example, who beat John Romero at Doom, his own game. Women have always been present in the space, but because they haven't been as prominent or as heavily linked to the identity, they have been somewhat disempowered in how much control they can bring to gaming culture and communities.
So we've talked about this in kind of a roundabout way, but just this idea of the gamer identity, like how would you say it creates barriers for women's engagement with games? And again, feel free to bring back things that we've talked about already.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways. There's kind of, if we think about how games are made and who they're made for, there's kind of content barriers. And then if we think about game communities, there's social barriers. So because games have this long history of targeting an imagined gamer, who is a young adolescent male, a lot of games feature male characters, hypersexualize their female characters, tell stories that tend to fall more in line with traditional boy culture, stories about war and shooting and sports and things like that. And so women have to decide if those types of content are of interest to them. And then if those types of content are of interest to them, are they willing to play a game where they have to play a male character? Are they willing to play a game where the female characters are hypersexualized and kind of poorly fleshed out token characters? These are barriers they have to navigate. And they are actually quite good at this. The women I spoke with have these extremely detailed processes for discovering if a game is going to be worth their time or energy, which we can get to in a future podcast because it would take a long time to talk about now.
Right, that would be fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah.
So their
definitely.
kind of content negotiation approaches are key. Then they have to deal with the kind of in-group and out-group dynamics that humans are so good at. Because this stereotype of who games are for and who they've targeted for so long has been very powerful, women, as I said, are often questioned when they are in gaming spaces. Oh, why are you here? Are you here to meet guys? Like, are you actually any good at this game? And so they often have to deal with those pressures. And so figuring out how to navigate where they forefront their skill, where they try and minimize or dismiss their gender identity so they can be seen as just gamers, versus when they forefront the fact that they're female to combat those stereotypes, it's a kind of ongoing process that every person approaches differently, which is also really interesting. Based on their personality and what they're good at, they have different strategies for doing this. But yeah, this stereotype means that games have been created for particular kinds of people with forms of content that designers think will appeal to those people. And then that builds a community where some people are expected to be part of it and others are seen as outsiders or invaders.
Okay, so I think this can get us to the point of talking about the current situation, Right. And of course, this is all part of the current situation, but you describe the current situation as essentially being in a crisis of authority when it comes to gender in games. So let's tell us about that. That seems really, really key.
Yes. So I borrowed a theory from Antonio Gramsci, a political theorist from around the World War II era. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist who ended up being thrown in prison by Mussolini's fascist government for protesting against the rise of fascism in Italy. While in prison, he wrote an extensive series of theoretical pieces that are lumped together in a book called The Prison Notebooks. And so he talks about power and how power holds on to its own ability to perpetuate, and also how systems of power can change over time. So Antonio Gramsci came up with the concept of hegemony, or hegemony, depending on who's pronouncing it, which is the idea that the status quo, the existing way of doing things, stays in power because the powerful normalize systems of belief that support their continued power. That there's this kind of taken for grantedness about how things work because, this is how things work. This is how things have always worked. And so when hegemony is functioning, systems of power stay in place just through this process of common sense. But of course, not everybody's empowered in a system, and so people will push back against that. And sometimes if a pushback is strong enough, a moment that Gramsci refers to as a crisis of authority, this common sense maintenance of power is no longer strong enough. So he says, in a crisis of authority, the people who are in power will have to use force to defend their position instead. And of course, Gramsci is talking about big political shifts like the rise of fascism in Italy. And so when he says force, he's talking about, police and the military. Mm-hmm. So even though I'm talking about things on a much smaller level than Gramsci is, the theory maps onto games really well, where we've had this hegemonic idea for a long time that games are meant to look a certain way for a certain group of people, and that's just what games are. And when new forms of games, new platforms, new players start to question that, it's this moment where things either could change to be more inclusive and broaden out, or where if the powerful group exerts enough force, they can maintain the system the way it is. And so I argue in the book that things like harassment and discrimination against new types of games and new types of gamers is that kind of force, that crisis of authority. So it's a really interesting moment because a crisis of authority either ends with change or it ends with the reaffirmation of the existing system. And we're still kind of figuring out where we're going in this one.
And if change happens, I'm assuming those who are currently in power, which would be your traditional quote-unquote gamers, right, also lose their identity. Is their identity at stake in this as well?
I think a lot of people feel their identity is at stake because they have for so long defined themselves as this is who I am, this is what I do, this is what people like me look like. I will say I don't actually think that the diversification of gaming will ruin it for existing gamers. The intro of casual games is not, in fact, taking time and energy away from traditional forms of games. It's kind of adding on. But when this process started, I think a lot of people were concerned that that wouldn't be the case. That if casual games were super successful, investment money that would have gone to traditional games would flow to casual games instead. And so I think there was this real fear that gaming was zero-sum, and that success for one sector of gaming meant a loss for another. And so far, it doesn't seem like that's been the case. It's been kind of a rising tide for everyone instead.
That's interesting.
To me, the question is a little different. I do think of, spheres like being a hipster, right? Where you do feel like, where you were there first, and when everybody else discovers your thing, it feels like it lessens it. You're not special anymore. And notice, right? And in some way, it just doesn't make sense because your thing that you thought was so beautiful and amazing, now the rest of the world gets to discover. And, you can't deny that it's good that other people get to, discover the good and amazing. But I could also very much see how that could feel like you yourself lost something that was special to you.
Yeah.
Well, right, and I should say that that's precisely how I have navigated this, because as the nerdy, skinny, brainy kid, I discovered D&D, and it was an escape from the social crushing BS that people deal with in high school and junior high, but that's precisely the way that I handled it. Is I decided that this is cool, and I want to invite more people in. Right. And, and then of course, then I discovered, through the history, finding out that, this actually wasn't my space to begin with. There were people here before me, and they were, of course, very diverse people here before me. So it wasn't all just people who looked like me that played D&D in high school. Right. So, learning more about the history of it and also being open to inviting people in is precisely how I navigated this.
Yeah, and it's definitely like those are real feelings that people have and have to figure out how to deal with. And so it was really interesting to speak to female gamers who kind of understood why people responded to their presence in the way they did and were very aware of these kind of existing power structures. Well, of course, men feel like gaming is their space. Look at all these things that have marked that out for them. And of course, they see, games that feature female characters as potentially a divergence from that. But they argued that male gamers deserved more credit. They argued that targeting men specifically and only on certain forms of adolescent masculinity, which a lot of game advertisement has relied on, really kind of tokenized men as well and said, if we got to throw in a sexy female character because that's how we're going to reach men, they said, well, that argues that men can't empathize with characters or care about them for any reason other than their appearance, and that's not our experience. And so they ended up arguing that diversifying games, while it might be a bit of a challenge at the start, would actually be better for everyone because it would allow people a broader range of different experiences. But until you know what it looks like on the other side, that idea of change can be tough.
Yeah. That was a great point.
And you're right. I've often felt insulted by the pandering. Right?
Yeah, you're not a teenage boy, and anymore, right? It is really weird, right? Part of it as you grow throughout the years of the gamer, but in some ways the targeting remains very, very similar, right? Itself, like, there's something.
It makes me feel like I'm growing out of it.
Yeah, interesting, and that alienates
that's a
you.
bad thing for the industry to feel like, hey, this person who's loved games and would probably continue to love games is starting to feel like they're not part of it just because they're older and wiser.
Right. I mean, you're talking about generations, let's say, of gamers from the 80s that, soon enough will be grandparents. And,
already are.
Some already are, right?
Yeah.
Right. And and that's really interesting, right? Because, even from the male side, right? I mean, they would want games that connect with them in that stage of their lives. Okay, I want to. So this idea of this other idea is so you draw this picture where gaming and gamer identity is divided into these kind of core gamers, and this is kind of the core or hardcore, right, gamers, and that's masculine, and casual players, right, which is kind of like not real players or not real game, right, as sometimes they say, right, or casual gamers, and we'll put it in quotes. Right, which is kind of female and less category. And then the key kind of becomes that how do you maintain the identity of the core? And we can have our gamer, and those are the real gamers in the core. And female players will be kind of on the other side of it. And you say that the core is really kind of non-essential, right? And you could challenge it and reimagine it. And that this is already kind of happening, and that's what's causing this crisis of authority. So what exactly is this reimagining, right? How do you see this split between this core and casual gaming changing, going away, melding together? How would you describe it?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting question to follow up on our just previous point about kind of who gets included in games. So in the book, I argue that these concepts of core and casual are messy and flexible and multifaceted. We've traditionally kind of defined core gaming based around not only an identity, this young male identity we've talked about, but also forms and genres of games. So it's been PC and console games, it's been MMOs and first-person shooters and RPGs and those kinds of genres. And we define casual as my colleague Shira Chess in her book Ready Player 2 lays out this designed identity of a casual female gamer really, really well. But she says that we kind of conceptualize the casual gamer as female, but like Midwestern and middle class and kind of a mom figure at the same time, playing games while waiting to pick up her kids from soccer practice. And these designed identities, to steal her term, don't encompass all players, but they serve as kind of shorthand for who particular parts of the industry are targeting.
So is that an industry target? And is that an identity that the industry made by kind of targeting those women?
Yes, that's what she finds. So she actually kind of looks at design textbooks and speaks to designers and finds that they have this vision of their casual gamer as like a white Midwestern mom. She refers to this as Jennifer throughout her book, which is very funny.
So is it basically they just went and they took the casual they took the standard idea of a gamer, which was a white kid, and went, well, who's the mom of that kid?
Moms show up a lot in discourses about gaming. So part of my book, I do an analysis of video game press and kind of how people talk about the rise of casual games. And this is where I, for instance, collected the data that found a lot of people were anxious about this because they thought casual games would take away from more traditional forms. There was this great editorial in Game Developer where the editor was like, if games like Candy Crush keep succeeding, will we even be able to get an Assassin's Creed or a BioShock in 2020? And of course, obviously, we do have Assassin's Creeds and BioShocks and their equivalents in 2020. But this was like a real deeply felt anxiety that this new part of the industry was rising. And what if it's so successful it takes away from us? What if all the games in the future are made for moms? And it was like mom, mom, mom constantly. It was gamers versus moms. These were the two flip sides of things. And so it's really interesting how powerful that's become as a conception. This counter to the gamer stereotype is Midwestern moms. But of course, like neither of those holds up on close inspection. Casual gamers sometimes play casual games in very serious ways. They're not all Midwestern moms. I have completed a gross number of Candy Crush levels. Like I told my students the other day and they're like, you're joking. Nobody's completed that many Candy Crush levels. I introduced my grandparents to wordscapes, where you swipe letters on your phone. Mm-hmm. They beat every single level and now have to wait for developers to release new ones for them to continue playing wordscapes.
Oh,
so
that's awesome.
Casual gamers play in core ways. Core gamers sometimes play in casual ways. They pick up Breath of the Wild, they play for 2 days, they put it down, they come back, they have no idea where they were. And so I argue that these categories are used as shorthand for parts of the industry but don't hold up. And that's why I argue that these are non-essential. And if we accept that we can't categorize people this easily, it gives us a chance to rethink things. So we talked about how, you feel the core industry no longer really targets you as you get older and move away from this adolescent mindset. Well, it's also hard to find the time to play traditional forms of games. You don't have 300 hours to put into a Skyrim in order to beat it or even come close. You don't necessarily want to invest $60 in a game when you can't guarantee you'll ever finish it. And so I argue that accepting that these forms are shorthand and not true reflections of who games or what games are allows us to then rethink our models for how we target games, who we make them for, and it allows us to accept a broader array of players, but also games and game style approaches. So we no longer have to value committed, I'm going to sit down and play through this whole game in 4 days approaches to games. We can think about gameplay more broadly and therefore allow more people to engage with games in different ways while valuing those.
First of all, Jennifer, I just love that it's I think of my first girlfriend who was named Jennifer, who was from the Midwest. It's
Does she play casual games now?
I
Do you
have
know?
no idea.
Probably.
Right? I have no idea.
Probably.
Right?
Everybody does, right?
This was in the mid '80s. Right? So this is definitely a Gen X thing. Right? So it's interesting. So Gen X. This is the Gen X mom. But
I have a thing. I have a thing with generations. So
yeah, sure.
That like core and casual, they're made up. Is that what it is?
Sure. Yeah.
yeah.
But it's interesting, right? Because a name like Jennifer, right, is a name that trended, right, around that era. But it's right. This kind of leads to the question of whether the gamer identity is itself. Does it serve a function anymore, right? I mean, you talked about how the casual core distinction itself might not be very important. How people play games in so many different ways. Is the idea of a core gamer itself kind of too big? Do we need to kind of say the kind of games you play, the kind of commitment you have to gaming? Is that what core gaming means? In terms of identity, what do you think is useful in that space?
I will say, first, before I answer this question, Shira Chess's book is phenomenal. It's called Ready Player 2. It's about casual gamers. The Jennifer concept is very well done. Highly recommend.
Is it connected at all to The Second Sex in Ready Player 2, right? Where in The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir has, right, woman is the other sex, and here, woman is the other player? I'm assuming.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. But to answer the question about is core gamer identity or even gamer identity useful, I'm a big proponent of doing what you love, but not gatekeeping around it. And so I think that that's the issue here is like, it's great to be a fan of something. It's great to be an advocate for things you love. If World of Warcraft is your social network and how you met all of your friends and you love it and want to tell people about how great it is, go for it. But I think where we get to the issue is where we argue in order to be a true World of Warcraft player, you must have done A, B, and C. You must have played since the first edition and you must be whatever the highest level is now, I think 80. It's been a long time since I played World of Warcraft, again, because I got old and don't have time anymore. When enthusiasm and a desire to share or celebrate the thing you love devolves into that form of gatekeeping, I think that's where identity becomes more problematic, or where this defining yourself around an identity is less useful. We see it in other spaces like comic books. Longtime comic book fans, some of them hate the Marvel series because they're like, you're ruining this hobby I've invested in for so long. These are not the representations of my comic books. But like those got a lot of people into comic books and into these stories. And I think celebrating that, like, sweet, now I get to share this thing I love with all these new people, is the much more productive way of approaching things. And gatekeeping and barring people or marking some forms of games as less than because they don't fit the kind you like, that's where I think the problem comes from.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I kind of want to bring in a little bit more about tabletop gaming, because certainly, like, in my experience, the places that I started seeing more women like taking their seats and taking their seats around the table was things like Vampire the Masquerade, and then in the 90s, sit-down role-playing games that were not D&D, like rising up and attracting more women as players. And did those women then branch out and start playing other games after that? Like, what was that just a step along the way, or was it its own thing?
In terms of kind of numbers and distribution, I'm afraid I don't have those for analog gaming. But my colleague Tanya Pabuda is a grad student who's actually studying that. She's studying gender in board games and finds it really interesting. What I can say is some board games made deliberate attempts to diversify their audiences from the start. For instance, alternating he and she pronouns throughout their rule decks, or even using the gender neutral they throughout, through character design, through how they promote at conventions, etc. Some board games have been more popular. Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, was not traditionally very good at this. Dungeons and Dragons has a very long history of being seen predominantly as a space for men and boys. Dungeons and Dragons has recently done a lot to try and overcome that, which is fascinating. I mentioned this
with the usual backlash.
Yes. I mentioned this to both of you briefly before we started the podcast, but for my book, I interviewed women originally in 2012 and 2013, and then a lot in gender and games happened in that time period, so I tried to re-interview the same women in 2017, 2018, and I managed to reconnect with about a quarter to a third of my participants. Of the 11 I reconnected with, 3/4 of them had started playing Dungeons and Dragons in the 5 years between our interviews. Had not been playing at time 1, had started at time 2. And it was like over and over and over again. They're like, oh yeah, I've gotten really into Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, I don't really play video games anymore, but I do play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. And at first I was like, okay, maybe this is a time thing. Like maybe D&D takes less time than video gaming. That quickly did not hold up because one of them was like in one group DMing another. It was like hours and hours of preparation every week, very involved. So what I ended up finding was the case was that Dungeons and Dragons had done a lot of work to make itself more inclusive in this time period. So the 5th edition diversified representations of characters. You know, the default representation of human in the player's handbook is a black woman. They added notes on pronouns and gender identity and sexuality throughout the rule book. They hired new types of designers to kind of double check what they were doing. And then, of course, D&D became very popular in things like live streaming. So, of course, we think Critical Role. And so this demoed a more diverse group of D&D players to potential new players. And so
the people casting those shows are very, very conscious of making sure that they have a diverse group of people playing.
And of course, like those people, especially when they're actors and actresses, are like cooler than we think of the traditional Dungeons and Dragons stereotype. Like Joe Manganiello is not a traditional Dungeons and Dragons stereotype.
Right.
And so,
and is that changing that identity idea?
Yeah. So this is really revamping kind of the conception of who a D&D player is. And so all of these female gamers joined Dungeons and Dragons, this game that has an almost 50-year history, where for a long period of time that probably wouldn't have been where they turned because of these deliberate attempts to market D&D to a broader audience. That broader audience showed up, and they argued that D&D gave them all the things that they'd enjoyed about video gaming, mechanics, the ability to take on different characters, to play through a storyline, social interaction, but they felt like it was easier to play that because they didn't have to worry about who they were playing with or how they'd be treated. They could just go in and have fun and get everything they wanted out of video games in an analog format. And so it was this fascinating shift of 3/4 of the people I spoke to suddenly playing Dungeons and Dragons, often in very involved ways.
You know, I have to say, when you mentioned this before we started, I thought this was just a very sad story of women escaping the toxic world of video games into an alternate way. But this is great. This is essentially, You have a form of gaming that took steps to create an accepting identity, an identity that welcomed women, and women flock to those spaces. And obviously, there's a lesson here, about how to get women to flock to your gaming space by taking those steps.
And it is, of course, like still a little bit as well of video games have not addressed their problems as effectively, so women found alternatives. But yeah, it's an active, thoughtful audience who knows the space really well and is able to navigate through many different forms to find what they want. And so I would argue that if video games do this same kind of work, there's a much broader audience to be gained for game developers, first and foremost, if we're thinking about this in a pure business sense. But then there's also a much bigger community of people and ideas that could be brought to games. And we see evidence of that. So the Dragon Age series, the Mass Effect series, super, super popular among my participants because those series did the work to show that they cared about more than just the traditional gamer. They added female characters, they added LGBT storylines, and so gamers recognized, hey, these people are at least thinking of me a little bit, let me gravitate towards them. So my participants could name individual developers, game series, etc., that they thought were already doing the work of thinking about their audience in broader ways, and they supported that with their dollars, with their fandom, with their energy.
Thanks, Amanda. Cody, go ahead. Amanda, do you want to tell them if people want to get in touch with you and to interweb or anything, where they would do that?
Yeah, of course. Twitter is probably the best place. It's ACCOTE is my Twitter handle. And if you're interested in me or the book, you can also find my website at amandaccote.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
thanks
so
for
much
having
for being
me.
here. All right, GP, good podcast, everybody.